This is Learning with Coach History.
All right, this is the fifth lesson in conservatism. That's Reagan and Bush confront domestic concerns. And your vocab, Reaganomics, supply side economics, Sandra Day O'Connor, deregulation, Environmental Protection Agency, and AIDS. Reagan tried to reduce the size and power of the federal government. He asked for deep cuts in government spendings on social programs. In general, programs affecting the poor rather than the middle class were cut. Reagan also convinced Congress to lower taxes. This approach was called Reaganomics. Reaganomics depended on supply-side economics. This theory said that cutting taxes would motivate people to work, save, and invest. More investment would create more jobs. More workers would mean more taxpayers, which would cause government revenues to increase. Reagan's tax cuts mainly benefited the wealthy because of the president's beliefs in the trickle-down theory. According to this theory, some of the money acquired by the wealth would ultimately reach other citizens. Reagan also increased military spending. Between 1981 and 1984, the Defense Department budget almost doubled. This was one reason that the nation's deficit grew. For a while, the economy sank into a recession. The economy rebounded once interest rates and inflation rates dropped. Economic downturns hit the savings and loan industry hard. More than 1,000 service and loan businesses closed their doors. Taxpayers lost more than $120 million. Government revenues did not increase as much as Reagan hoped. So the federal government ran up huge budget deficits. During Reagan's first term, the size of the government debt had almost doubled. Reagan was able to make the Supreme Court more conservative through his appointments. He nominated Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, and Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court. O'Connor was the first woman appointed to the court. Reagan also nominated Justice William Rehnquist to the position of Chief Justice. President George Bush later made the court more conservative when he nominated David Souter and Clarence Thomas. In many decisions, the court moved away from the more liberal rulings of the previous 40 years. The court restricted a women's right to abortion, put limits on civil rights laws, and narrowed the rights of arrested persons. Reagan tried to reduce the power of government through deregulation. He cut back on government rules related to industry and removed price controls on oil and gas. He deregulated the airline industry and ended government regulation of the savings and loan industry. Positive effects including increased competition and lower prices. Reagan also reduced environmental regulation. He cut the budget of the Environmental Protection Agency. He ignored requests from Canada to reduce acid rain. Reagan appointed opponents of environmental regulation to oversee the environment. James Watt, Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, took many actions that were questioned by environmentalists. He sold millions of acres of public land to private developers, allowed drilling for oil and gas in the continental shelf, encouraged timber cutting in national forests, and eased restriction on coal mining. A scary health issue that arose in the 1980s was AIDS. the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The disease is caused by a virus that destroys the immune system that protects people from illness. Most of the early AIDS victims were either homosexual men or intravenous drug users who shared needles. Many people also contracted AIDS through contaminated blood transfusions. AIDS began spreading throughout the world possibly as early as the 1960s. The United States began a campaign to treat AIDS around the world. Another issue that concerned Americans was abortion. In 1973, Roe v. Wade decision, the Supreme Court said women had the right to have an abortion. Opponents of legalized abortion described themselves as pro-life. Supporters of legalized abortion called themselves pro-choice. In 1989, the Supreme Court ruled in Webster v. Reproductive Health Care Services that individual states could place their own restrictions on abortion. Battles over abortion rights often competed for attention with concerns over rising drug abuse. The Reagan administration declared a war on drugs. Reagan supported laws to catch drug users and drug dealers. Education remained an important issue. In 1983, a report entitled A Nation at Risk criticized the nation's schools. The report showed that American students' test scores lagged behind those of students in other nations. The findings started a debate about the quality of education. The commission recommended increased homework, longer school days and school year, and increased pay for teachers. It also asked for a greater emphasis on basic subjects such as English, math, and science. The nation's cities were also in crisis. Many poor people remained in cities as wealthier people moved to the suburbs. Businesses moved too, taking jobs and tax money with them. Poor people in cities often had little hope of finding jobs. They also faced crumbling buildings, lack of health services, and many social problems. Many city dwellers became homeless. In 1981, NASA hoped to revive interest in space with its new space shuttle program. Two firsts were achieved in 1983. Sally Ride became the first American woman in space, and Guyon Bluford became the first African American in space. Disaster struck in 1986 with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Teacher Krista McAuliffe was among the crew members killed. Space shuttle flights stopped for 2 years. George H.W. Bush vowed to continue to address the nation's domestic problems. He also promised to support volunteers who called 1,000 points of light. Bush could not address all his plans. The federal deficit had risen dramatically. Bush had promised citizens no new taxes, and this limited the amount of money available to address social issues. Bush did introduce a plan to offer parents greater say in choosing schools. Bush also signed two important laws. These landmark laws were the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Clean Air Act amendments. Bush had impressive foreign policy success, but they were overshadowed by his minimal domestic success. Republican leadership of the nation came to an end when Bush lost his bid for re-election.